Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Tom Christie with d20play, and we have with me David of dmdavid.com, John at Radiating Gnome, and Teos Abadia from at AlphaStream is your Twitter handle, right, Teos?
Yeah, it is indeed.
Okay, so Teos, why don't you tell us about your origin story? When did you start playing D&D, and was it lifelong from then, or were there gaps?
Yeah. There were some gaps. It was hot and cold at times, but it all started when my mother, who was an English teacher, said to me, "Not you need friends," but said, "I know a group that's playing a game that I think you would like." And I said, "Okay, whatever, I'll go." And these kids were playing D&D, and I have lots of deep memories of what it was like to walk up to these older kids. I was 12, and they were like 14, which, as you know, is immeasurably older and more mature and cool. And they, were like, "What kind of character do you want to make?" And then someone's like, "You'll make a fighter." It's like, "Oh, I'll make a fighter." You know, "What's your name?" I'm like, "I don't know, Zeus." They're like, "Oh, Zeus is gonna come and kill you." And it was just, all that kind of like, oh my god, like it was such a thing, right, to take in. So all right, I'll make a different character name, and and then you start playing, and you're like, "What is this? This is incredible." So I played for a lot of years, and then when I got to that, this was in Colombia, South America. When I got to the States, I nobody was playing in my high school. Were very few people, and so I couldn't do anything. And I actually took everything I owned, which I'd slowly, purchased over the years, and I put in a garage sale, and not a single thing sold. And I'm so happy
Thank
about
God.
that today.
Thank God.
What a break.
you know, I also had a time during 2E where I just hit a wall of like, I've played this game too much. Even though I played other games, I was just like, I'm so done with D&D, and I took I think like a year and a half off, which back then seemed immeasurably long, from D&D, and then came back with a little bit of 2E, but mostly when third edition came back in around Living Greyhawk. So there've been some times when I've stepped away and done other things, but so far it's been pretty good, and I remark upon how 5e has stayed relatively fresh for so many years for me.
Well, I first became aware of your contribution to the hobby when you were running this Ashes of Athas campaign for fourth edition, which I, at times I'm thinking, wow, what a cool project to do. And at other times I'm thinking, how did you manage to do it? It sounds like such a scale of an undertaking. And you must have had small kids in the house at the time, a full-time job.
Yeah.
What's the secret
I mean, I was just talking to
sauce?
my wife about that, about how I love doing this stuff, but it's a little bit like exercise. And this is what I was saying to my wife. Like, it's like exercise. It's like, I really should exercise today, except I really should write today, right?
Yeah.
Or do the thing, whatever those things are. And you know that once you do it, it'll feel great. It's good for you. You're going to be happy, all of that. But you've got to like, because you just finished a long work day and, doing all the things that one does in a relationship, as a parent, all those things. And it was hard. Ashes of Athas was me going back on my word, where I swore I would never be stupid enough to be the admin of an organized play campaign. And then Dave Christ of Baldman Games said, "Hey, we're going to have a Dark Sun organized play campaign. I'd like you to lead it up." And I just said, well, yes, because I love the world of Dark Sun. I think the setting's amazing. I would love to bring it to 5e. But when it came out for 4e, that was just really an opportunity I couldn't say no to. Both to give back to all the admins that I'd benefited from during the Living Greyhawk years and other campaigns. And also because back then the organized play was so it was so living Forgotten Realms. Like, there was one thing and one approach, and it was very dominant. And I thought the world could really use an alt campaign that is done a different way, deliberately, and isn't trying to be living Forgotten Realms, isn't trying to be the big main thing, but is trying to be a little more indie, a little more, a little more heavy metal, a little more alt. And so we did that, and it was really cool. And one of the giant lessons of being an organized play admin is that it's like having a machine with levers where you put one into the fixed position, something else must pop into the broken position. And that's always true. And you can go back to the other, and then a different one goes. It's like a game like that. And so you end up making decisions that people are like, why did you do this thing? And you're like, well, I had to, or it was the thing I had to give up to get this other thing. And so you learn a lot being an admin. I did it for a little over 3 years. And all of my companions were far stronger. Derek Gooder, Chad Brown, they were way stronger than I was. They were like, we're going to do this forever, right? And I was like, no, when we hit year 3, I'm done. Like, that's a great story. That's a great campaign. And it was. I mean, we had the final at a Winter Fantasy, and the story was epic. What the people, and everybody got to talk about what they chose to do at the end. And so it was like one of those campaigns that the ending was very sweet, even if sad to see end. It was, invested people making hard decisions and leaving the world slightly changed. We did not, bring back gods or anything like that, but we left the real potential for change in the setting, and that felt good to everybody. So
You mentioned that you'd love to bring Dark Sun forward to 5th edition. I'm curious what things would have to change and what things you love about the setting that you'd feel like you need to keep.
So I love what I initially hated about it. So when Dark Sun came out, I was in college, and I had a college group that I ran, and they were like, we should buy this. And I'm like, that looks terrible. It looks like it's changing everything about D&D. It also looks like a Munchkin setting. You're playing high level and half giants, and it's halflings are cannibals. This just sounds weird. So they bought it, and they gave it to me, and they said, now you'll run it. And so I opened it up and started reading it. I'm like, okay, this is amazing, because it just takes everything about D&D and just flips it upside down, right? Like, the elves are not proud forest dwellers. They're essentially like thieves trying to live out of the scraps of what society lives, right? And you have you are not heroes. You are more almost like in Shadowrun, right? You're living in the cracks of society, trying to endure in these autocratic, theocratic societies. And what needs to be fixed about that is that while it was always actually heroic, but you had to be those kinds of heroes that are in the cracks. It involved the themes of slavery very strongly, and that would need to change, right? So you would need to work with a team that could undo that part of it. But I don't think that's particularly hard, because we live in worlds where that concept of a single leader having way too much power, of a pyramid-shaped society, and those rungs down below are making decisions for you without your input, and that every day it feels like you're more and more apart from the people that have great wealth. That is all very resonant, right? And those are the underpinnings that come from what it's almost lazy to just say slavery in a setting, because that's seldom the thing that you're talking about truly in a D&D type world. You're talking about much larger themes, and those are the right themes to focus on rather than that. And the reason is because when you talk about slavery, it's hurtful, right? So it is a problematic thing to engage with that takes away from people's fun. Not everybody, but enough people that it matters. And so that is one of the main things that needs to change in the setting.
Cool. So you're doing a lot of publishing and stuff like that on DM's Guild and stuff like that. Where do you think the open design space or blue ocean sort of is for that kind of publishing? What do people need the most of that isn't really being supplied right now?
That's a tough one to answer, because I both love the DM's Guild and no longer use it. And that's maybe as it should be, right? So it's one of those things that if you step back and you strip out your emotions from it, maybe that's exactly, that's a plan well played.
Right.
The DM's Guild has one of the most onerous agreements you could find, right? Where you are locking up everything you created in one place, and you can't do anything with it other than have it sit there, but you own it. Congratulations, right. You own it, and you get half of what it earns, right? And in exchange for all those onerous agreements and locking it up forever, you get to market something in a way that you might not otherwise be able to. And that's the real benefit, right? Is that if you don't have anywhere else to do things, or you just are looking to get started or looking for an audience, well, that's a great place to do. If you want more freedom, then you can go to Drive-Thru. And if you want to try to be independent a step beyond, you can go to other places and you can put it on your own website and so on. But but I've experimented with a number of things, and I think the difficulty is that in the end, it falls down on the creator to run a business, and you have to be able to do that well for it to work, right? And you can look at the people who've really succeeded at it, the Jeff Stevens, the MT Blacks, people like that, the Mike Shays, and you can see the different models that work, and they all involve a tremendous amount of hard work and diligence to grow your brand, to repeatedly create top-notch content, right? And to experiment with how you do that. And so in some ways, the platform is less critical because there are options there, including whatever you want to devise, right? Or Patreon or things like that. And so I've played with a little bit of all of it, enough to know there's no easy money, or not much of it. And anything that looks like easy money will quickly change because other people will arrive. That's what happened in the DMs Guild back when it was easy money.
Yeah.
And so you've got to kind of keep working at it within whatever you're willing to do. And for me, a big thing is I've got to be having fun, right? It can't feel like I'm polishing widgets on the shop room floor, because then I just get a polishing widgets at the shop room floor job, right? Like this to me is my alt thing. It's my creativity. It's joy. Writing is joy, unlike some people, and I'm sorry for those, but I enjoy the act of carving words and putting them together. I enjoy the thought of what the product will accomplish with people. So I always want to enjoy that. And if the answer to something is, well, I must do 6 of them, and I don't really have the time for that, then I'm not going to go down that road, right? So I think that it's important when what I try to do with I have a YouTube show, Success in RPGs, and what I try to talk about in that is that kind of larger pullback mentality of examining what you're doing and seeing whether it actually really is working, right? Is it making you money? Is it worth the time you're putting into, right? So a thing that many creators don't do is add up the value of your time, right? And I'll ask some creators, and including some of the really big ones, I used to say, I'd say to them, how much time did you spend on this? Well, I'm not sure. I don't count my time. It's like, you probably should, right? Because your time is valuable. And we see examples of people sharing things on Twitter, where if you account for your time, the project is a loss, and a big loss, right?
Right.
Well, it better be super fun if you're going to take that kind of financial. If you're paying to create, then it better be really fun for you.
Yeah.
I've seen you talking about challenge ratings and foes, and that's like a low-hanging fruit for someone to complain about, in my opinion. It's like, of course, you can't have a challenge rating system that works for all groups because all groups are different. So I believe you're working on a project with Mike Shea that might kind of address that a little bit.
Yeah,
You talk about that at all?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I'm really excited about this. So one is that it's sort of like getting the band back together, because one of the best projects I ever did was to work with Mike Shea and Scott Fitzgerald Gray on this project called Vault of the Draculich. And every moment of that project was fun. We had weekly meetings, and they were just creative and really neat, and just, and everybody was amazing, right? Like I'd say, well, I think we need to have some sort of a map, and Scott would be like, well, I can just take that map and make it into a draft, and I can do these things. In fact, Scott can actually do everything. We're just auxiliary, but and he would take all our words and make them better. And Mike would just, you'd talk about an idea, and Mike would have it all written the next day, right? And just so dream team to work with them again. And so they had this idea of a monster book, and they brought me in because of all that work and talking I'd done about monsters. And also that I'd had a long-standing project that I've been thinking about probably like 4 years ago at Winter Fantasy. I was thinking through, what if you brought back the concept of like 4E monster themes, right? Where you add a power to a creature. And that's one of the things that we brought into this, that I'd been toying about maybe doing my own project, but it made a lot of sense to bring it into this project. And so this tome, Forge of Foes, is the next in Mike's Lazy DM series. And it has that approach that his other books do that's been so welcomed by people, right? That is instructional, it's conversational, it's really giving you sort of stripped down away from rules and complicated factors, and just say, what is it that you can do to accomplish this goal? And each page in the book, each section is an important thing that you're thinking about, right? Like one of the ones that I wrote was, how do you make encounters engaging? What is it that is going to grab the players at your table and have them go like, oh yeah, I'm putting my phone down. Okay, we got to do something to win. We got to do this thing, right? Like, wait, what do you think those things do? Do you want to check that thing out, right? And so how do you do that, right? And so it's a very short read, and it gives you examples and ideas, and at the end of it, you're set, right? Or how to build a monster in a couple of different ways, right? Like we analyze, what does the DMG's way mean? And why is it built this way? And what are its problems? And what should you recognize about that? How does it make your game better to understand why those official rules fall short? And then, hey, here's a way that you can do it really quickly. And you can even put in blocks, right? So, oh, it's an aberrant, cool. Chuck this in it. Now it's an aberrant, right? And then add a cool power that, lets it, like, oh, I don't know, elongate its limbs and grab something that's trying to get out of what should be its reach, but it's actually far larger, right? Just neat things like that really are evocative and engaging to players. So I am so excited about this. I hope it does gangbusters, because it was great fun to put this together. And so it's all written. It's going through editing, and the art's amazing. I think it's going to be just a fantastic, fantastic tool for folks to use.
Right. So this isn't a monster book. It isn't a collection of monsters, but more of a encounter building advice, how to make your the most of your monsters, how to customize monsters.
Yeah. So it's truly a forge, right? It's a workshop. It's a alchemical laboratory where you pull all these things together, right? So it's everything you need to make the things you already have work better around monsters. And that includes things like the terrain in an encounter, right? And how the monsters play off of it. Understanding how to run high-level games with your monsters, right? What to do to protect them, to make them capable, all those kinds of things.
Well, that sounds exciting. I'm ready for the high-level advice.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I didn't read your words when it came to working on that. I reread all of your blogs on the topic, and Alan Patrick's work as well.
Yeah.
Because it's fun, sometimes I'm talking to a friend and they'll say like, yeah, we had this super easy fight against the following creatures. And I'm like, those are actually really good creatures for their CR. Explain to me what happened, right? And then they'll be like, well, they were at the tree line. So then we hit them with hypnotic pattern, and then we picked them off one by one. And so they never acted. Yeah. I see how that was an easy encounter, right?
Yes.
And then my question was, I wonder if your DM knows what went wrong. I wonder if they know that next time, if they drop these monsters right on the party, it's going to be entirely different, right? And so that's the kind of thing that we break down and look at in one of the sections of the book, because it's really, if you learn to do that as a DM, you get a lot better really quickly, right? If you just change up, or just look at the creatures you have and say, where should these start on the battle map, right? Or do you always find that like your players are the characters are all in the hallway, right? Like, how do we change that so they're not just in the hallway? That was something that happened in 3rd edition games a lot, right? Because everybody would buff outside the door, which gave attention to the hallway and the door, and open the door and never go in. And there's this fascinating room beyond that no one's inside of.
I've run way too many encounters where everyone's at the door and nobody moves, and it's just trading blows like a piñata or something. It just does not work.
The other thing that can happen is the opposite, which is because 4th edition, which I loved, taught us that whatever map you're on is the encounter map, right? So it's one encounter. And if you give your players a bigger map that has different encounters in it that they can bump into, they will take that fight and expand it to include all the encounters that you have on your map and get themselves wiped super fast that way.
Yeah.
Or at least challenge
4th edition
way more than they needed to.
If you were trained in 4th edition, it was a dangerous thing to come into 5th edition sometimes. Yeah.
I had an encounter that I wrote for Living Forgotten Realms where I am really positive, this is a claim I'm glad to back up through any number of playtests, that every single square matters on that map. Like, if I move a monster 1 square, it's less effective, right? Like, everything is perfectly positioned to achieve what the encounter does, because that's what 4th edition allowed you to do, right? With auras, with ranges of powers, with blasts and bursts and so on. And when I ran that encounter, it was really funny. One time, the wizard moved again, and used a teleportation power. And I said, and all of it to be off the map. And I said, why? He says, that's the only way I'll live. And they were smiling, right? They're having a blast. They're like, I have figured out how to not die this round. And it's move, teleport. Like, okay, that is pretty cool. That's what a volcanic dragon will do.
So, one of your more recent products on your list there was about building collaborative campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that Tom and I did years ago for a very long time. And I don't know that we ever got it right. But is that something a lot of people are doing? Is that what should Tom and I have done right?
Well, that's a good question. So in this case, what this refers to is it's based off of kind of two things. One is when I played Dresden Files and how that blew my mind. And they had a very specific set of rules there. You can also find a Fate, I don't know if it's called a toolkit or what it is, but an expansion that someone wrote basically using those rules and applying it to Fate more widely. But then I was on the Dragon Talk podcast sort of talking about this as a sort of an approach that you can take. And the concept is really that when you are going to play a campaign, you, in a sort of session zero type environment, work with the players to come up with setting elements. And that sounds, at least if I had told myself this before doing this, that would have sounded kind of weird and well, shouldn't the DM and don't the players want this? But what it does is, in one game of like Dresden Files where you use this type of technique, you end up knowing, all the players know so much about the campaign and the setting that they are now really playing in that as if they lived there, the way that they would if they actually lived there, right? Whereas, and I remember thinking when I played Dresden Files, in one session, I knew more as a player about this world than my players in my then Dark Sand campaign knew about the setting in probably, 2 months of playing. Because everything's sort of slow and coming out, right? But when you take apart it, and it's things like we were doing for Dresden Files, we were doing something where it was like, okay, what city do we start in? And we talked about maybe it's Chicago, and then in the end we ended up saying, well, let's do it where we live. Let's do it in Portland. Okay, tell me 3 things about Portland. And it's like, the forests are fey. The city council are wizards. I think it was something like the docks are hairy, but really what we meant is werewolves are all throughout sort of the working class, right? And I still remember these, and this is many, many years ago, right? I still remember these because they became, those are like the underpinnings of what the city's about. And now the DM is just full of ideas, right? They know all these things about what's going on in Portland. And, you immediately start thinking about intrigue with the city council of wizards, right? What are they up to? And what is in the forest that makes this so faith-filled? And I mean, you just start going off of that, right? And we knew what the city was about, and we created other aspects as well for the city itself and for us, and then it all linked in, right? I was a member of the police force, and so I tied into that, and so that's what that guide is trying to do, is to encourage that kind of thinking in any kind of setting, but including in D&D, right, where you just ask a certain number of questions and it walks you through how to do that, so you come up with these ideas between player and GM.
Yeah, I think that's the systems that do that are really, really powerful. So I'm gonna have to check that out too from you. But yeah, I mean, you can do in classic D&D preparation, if you get players who give you good backstories and stuff like that, you can tease out a little bit of that, but it's not as well organized or really targeted at building the world. And then you have to go back and then mine it to try and bring them into the story.
And I think doing it up front works with most players. Like I've had DMs, like say Keith Baker, for example, who I'm fortunate lives in Portland. He loves doing things like saying like, okay, you walk in, tell me about the bartender. And truth be told, I don't super love that. To me, it's like the world is yours and I'm visiting it. You tell me what the world is like, because I'm now in the game and I want to not know whether it's up to me because now the bartender truly doesn't matter. I mean, I know he'll riff off of it, right? And Keith is better than most people, so he's fantastically so. So he will do a lot with whatever ideas I come up with the bartender. But your average DM, now you've told me I don't know what the bartender is, and maybe it doesn't even matter. And
Right.
that detracts from my experience, right? But doing it before I start playing creates a setting that I'm now invested in and interested in, because I don't know the answers, and I don't know the secrets, and I don't know what you'll do with it, and I don't know where it'll go. We haven't started playing yet, right? But now I understand it really well.
Well, let's transition into recently you did an interview with Kyle Brink about the whole OGL, the meltdown that happened at the end of January, Wizards trying to claw back, goodwill, did a major change where they put the 5e SRD under Creative Commons. What were your big takeaways from that interview? And by the way, I thought you did a fantastic job at that interview.
Thanks. They reached out, Wizards reached out to a number of people, and I'm very, very thankful that somehow I'm on that list, because there are some really big names on that list, right? Bob the Builder and Ginny D, and just, Nerd Immersion, and those are all fantastic folks who and even on this issue have commanded, views that are eclipse anything like what I get or what Sean and I get on the Mastering Dungeons podcast. So I was very thankful that they reached out to me, and I chose to do it as part of the podcast. But they told all of us right up front, and I think it's indicative of how open they were on this. We are trying to do outreach. You can ask any questions you want. You can do whatever you want with this video. This is kind of, we will not do anything with it. Like, it's yours, right? And that was from the very beginning. That first email said all these things, right? So there's literally nothing to even go back and negotiate with them. It was all just so very fair and pro us. And so I said, sure, I am exceedingly glad to be a part of this. I have a number of questions, because as a person who really cares about D&D history, I'm not looking just at this particular moment, as incredible as it is, but the larger picture of how D&D works. And to me, it's important to try to figure out those underpinnings of, where is the line between Hasbro and Wizards, and Wizards and D&D, and what all this is. And I think we learned a lot on that. So, when it comes to what we learned, there had been some stories, kind of the perspective going around was like, well, the D&D team wasn't involved with this. And that's clearly not the case. The D&D team, various members of it, we don't have exact numbers, but we know that members of the D&D team, including Kyle, were involved with this thing for 2 years or more, right? And my own sources say, this goes back to 4th edition in the GSL, right? And I'm sure before that as well. I think 4E was a dodging of a bullet of encountering this same kind of approach, right? A hard line approach. And 4th edition felt with its GSL like it was a very hard thing. It could have been harder, right? And so clearly Wizards for a long time has been doubting the OGL, which I think makes sense. The OGL has a lot of problems in it for them. And they'd been thinking about this for an incredibly long time with a mixed team. It wasn't just Hasbro. It wasn't the suits at Wizards or at Hasbro. It was a lot of people. And 2 years worth, at some point, they decided to accelerate the work. And what came out was atrocious. And I tried to ask Kyle, based on things that I've heard over the years from many different Wizards employees, is it that people don't have a voice? Is it that they feel like if they speak up, they will be, their career suffers? And he says, no, I'm not convinced that, maybe that's just how he sees it, or maybe it's just kind of what he has to say. I mean, there's always a corporate perspective you have to stick to. I've done these kinds of conversations with clients where I say things that are true-ish, because you just can't say to them, our product is a disaster or whatever it might be, right? You have to find a way that's positive towards the future. So maybe he just chose to answer that way. I think so. I think that there are problems there, right? Because you had 2 years worth of thinking on this, and at some point you accelerated, and you had the D&D team involved, at least some members of it, and you came out with an absolutely atrocious policy. And I think there's a part around the question of whether it was a draft, that it's really hard to get to the answer of whether that first version was a draft or whether it was presented to people to sign. And I think it's because there was a lot that was going on, and this may be indicative of the overall problematic approach, that it wasn't just, hey, here's a draft, please review it, get it back to us. It was that plus, We are directly negotiating with you to create a direct agreement where we work with you, right? Whoever that entity was, those first people under NDA. And in that situation, you are no longer going to give proper feedback. You may, in fact, give no feedback because all you're focused on is the negotiation. That thing is so bad, right? You may not even say how bad it is to them because you can't offend the person you're negotiating with. You've got to work on the negotiation part. And so it may very well have been such a messy situation that Wizards didn't get the feedback of how bad it was because of how it was set up, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And I'm not saying that's exactly how it played out, but I think there's something like that to it, that out of these various conversations and interviews, it seems to me that the process was done in a way that prevented Wizards from getting proper feedback, prevented these partners, they should have been, from giving proper feedback. And you can see that because you had, obviously some of the people that have been named, right, Paizo, Kobold Press, who were part of this, are clearly being as competitive as can be right now, right? So they were never, this process never brought them in. And that's a poorly run process.
It seemed like by the time they were bringing the third-party publishers into the process, and this is just my impression and based on rumor and whatnot, they had already handed over the discussion to being a negotiation of the terms of a different licensing agreement that these folks might want to get into as quickly as they could. Yeah. And it was all framed as here are the closers on this business arrangement. What can we do for you now to make this deal today? By that time they weren't listening to feedback. They were trying to get the car sold or whatever it was.
Exactly. I'd liked his answer. I asked a question about whether the negotiation by Wizards is myopic, right? And this is something that I've heard in a number of cases where they negotiate with a partner hard, right? Like they are negotiating like it's an auto car sale, right? Like you said. And that is something you do when you don't care about the car dealership, right? You come in and you negotiate the rock bottom price on that, and you don't care whose feelings are hurt. You're coming out with the cheapest price you can on that car. But if what you want is a lasting relationship with that entity, then you behave differently, right? If you're
Yes.
in a client negotiation with a client that you plan on working with for many years and having business in many stages, you can't sharpen the knives to that point, right? You've got to work and give, and you have to be laughing and feel a friendship, a camaraderie out of it. And, I think, his answer was, well, maybe we all do our job well. So maybe the people who negotiate sort of just do their job too well, and there's no one looking at it. To which I want to say, well, isn't that your job, right? Like it's somebody's job and someone's not doing that job, right? And I'm not trying to say that unkindly. I don't do my day job perfectly either. And I'm guessing he doesn't, maybe he does, but like, I think that there is that sense, I've heard conversations about negotiations that have taken place in the past that are so, every drop of blood squeezed out of that stone, right? And that's not the point, right? If you look at something like Critical Role or ACK Inc. or any of these types of partnerships, the strategy should be let them have whatever they want. Mm-hmm. Like that is in our interest, right? And it's the same thing with things like DM's Guild or any of that, like give them another 5%. Like who cares? It's not about this, right? And so the royalty part of that 1.1 was so fascinating because it was just like, it's this bloodthirsty approach when you're not thirsting for blood to begin with. This is not where you're looking for your money. What are you doing, right? You're driving wedges. And it's that lack of a vision, right? That somehow it's this tunnel operating vision of mercilessness and I dare say hubris, right?
Uh-oh.
They would come in and tell us that we'd only succeeded because of the brand name, right? That's that kind of stuff you say when you can't hear your own words, right? When you can't see yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, it was so clearly painful from the, I don't do any development or any design, but I read that, I'm like, this is horrendous. All the people that do great things for your company, you're just trying to kill. Why would you ever do that? It was amazing to me.
Yeah.
I have a
Yeah,
question
and
that
I mean, and
maybe.
I'm a fan of Wizards, right? It's not like I say these things out of some kind. I'm not a D&D bad
Oh boy.
sort
You're
of
dropping
corporate
in and out a little
messages.
bit, Teos. Let's go to. So you bring up some good points about Project Black, or about the interaction, the relationship. Let's look at the Project Black flag.
Tom, I just have a
Oh, go ahead.
little bit of a question on this, and I guess I'm going to run into it with a little bit of ramp up here. I could see why Kyle drew the straw of being the one who was making the charm tour. He's very poised, and he's got definite nerd credential with that long running campaign he was talking about running. An impressive feat for any of us. And he used the term bounded accuracy in a sentence. So extra points from me on that. And I started listening to the beginning of the interview, and I was prepared to be completely charmed and reassured by his message. But one part of the interview, he started to feel a little bit uh, evasive, I guess. I don't know. Saying things that made me uncomfortable because they didn't quite add up. He was talking about the company's stated rationale for changing the OGL. And the big thing that he kept trotting out was the threat of a big, well-funded entrant hijacking the game and taking it in the wrong direction. Also, the potential of scammy NFTs. They can't be just regular NFTs because Hasbro's already got those, but you can't do the spammy kind. And then he goes on and he talks about this example case of the thing that they were trying to prevent, of the virtual reality D&D game with unsavory user-generated content. And that was the sort of thing that they wanted to prevent. So that's where I got puzzled, because that game couldn't be called D&D, and it doesn't
Yeah.
need the OGL to exist because it wouldn't be D&D. I know Wizards of the Coast hasn't forgotten about trademarks because Kyle kept mentioning them in the interview. So I suppose that they just hope we forget about trademarks ourselves, and we forget that you can't call that virtual reality game D&D, and it can't be confused with D&D because they can't call it D&D. So I didn't feel like his rationale made sense. To me, what makes sense is that through line from Wizard CEO Cynthia Williams saying that D&D is under monetized, and then rumors that a few months later, major third-party publishers were shown a new OGL and got a high-pressure sales pitch to sign a better royalty agreement now. Well, they still had the chance. Am I missing something? Is there something about that example that?
No, I think you're on the right track. And I think it's one of those cases where many things can be true, right? And if you work in corporate settings and with large companies, this is often the case. And I think that they started the process, back 2 years ago, whenever, where if you looked at the list of goals that they probably had, you'd probably go like, okay, yeah, mm-hmm. And at the end, probably someone would say, well, we hit all those goals, and yet it's a mess, right? And I've been on a lot of corporate projects like that where, or seen a lot. And when I'm on them, I tend to get fired for saying that they are terrible. But like those are the kind of things that I will speak up about, and people will either love that or not. But I think that what you're saying specifically is very true. That it doesn't make sense that this is about diversity and people coming up with scam NFTs or putting porn in D&D. That makes no sense. It somewhat makes sense that a big media is a threat. I think that is something they worry about. But I think the worry is probably that the OGL carries a language to it that is particularly permissive. And I think that's why they want the OGL to be gone. And I'm no lawyer, But I think that it has enough in it that someone could say, I can actually use the word D&D, right? Or I can use all of the engine of D&D and call it something else. And that'll be a segue for Black Flag at some point. But I think that's that's a problem, right? That is a problem. And if you were Wizards, it would be a problem to you, right? I think that they probably also have at the same time, right? All things are true. They probably also at the same time are like, how do we get people into a walled garden of D&D Beyond, virtual tabletop, microtransactions? And those things can be cold and soulless when they're spoken at the corporate level. Though what they're trying to do is meet shareholder value and be good capitalists, which is the name of the game, unfortunately for them. And that would lead one to try to drive those kinds of agreements, right? But probably once it all blows up, you just don't want to talk about that aspect of it. But there probably was some of that, right? I mean, and I don't know, right? But I think you're probably right. I tend to agree with you that there probably was also this real drive to try to create situations where everybody is focused on the D&D delivery in this virtual tabletop and that things can't pull you out of there.
So we could transition into Black Flag.
There you go.
So Kobold Press, I mean, this was in the days before 5e went to the went to Creative Commons. So everyone's like, well, this agreement's leaked is completely unacceptable. We'll never do that. We have to come up with our own system. We're going to have to do that in order to keep selling all our products that we have. And so I'm sure they started thinking about that. And the language in the design diary is pretty, not happy with Wizards of the Coast, is I guess how I put it. What are you guys' thoughts on that? David, you said you had something to
talk about that just for a minute. It's definitely not setting out this is what we want to achieve for this edition. We've got a new vision. We've got something to add. It is definitely a rebellion against that one monolith, that Tarask, that's controlling D&D. So it was interesting that the main goal stated in the design diary seems to be D&D is too important to leave to one company. And I thought back in 1975, a fellow named Ted Johnstone wrote into the venerable fanzine Alarums and Excursions. He said D&D is too important to leave to Gary Gygax. At the time, Gary Gygax was pretty much the dominating force in Dungeons and Dragons. Dave Arneson had been on the side since Gary took the torch and the idea. And Gary, in the second issue in 1975 July, wrote, I'm a supporter of the slogan that D&D is too important to leave to Gary Gygax. He said that, and he said it now belongs to the thousands of players enjoying it worldwide. So when Celeste Konowich writes D&D is too much to be owned by just one company, wow, that echoes back right to the beginning of the game. And I'm all for it. It's exciting to me that we've got different publishers who are going to take their own look at the game that we love, 5th edition, and polish it up and improve it. One of the great things about Kobold Press is they've got a lot of design weight, and they create a lot of products to support this endeavor. So it's exciting.
I think the release to the Creative Commons did take a little wind out of the sails, because now all of a sudden it's not owned by anyone. At least the core of it isn't, right?
Exactly. This is true.
Yeah.
I think the premise is fascinating. Like, would we say, Star Wars is too big for any one company to control? Marvel Comics is too big for any one entity to control. We should be able to make our own Star Wars, our own Marvel.
Well, that's the magic of role-playing games, isn't it? That everyone who starts playing one is just fired up to design their own classes, their own different variants
Yeah.
of the system to fix the system with their own fantasy heartbreaker. At the time when that was written in 75, there was one fantasy role-playing game. That was the beginning and the end. And you either worked on D&D, or you made a change to D&D to create your own system, or you left it to Gary Gygax, and nobody wanted to do that.
Well, yeah, and I mean, and part of that was that Gary's behavior, right, encouraged this sort of a column and approach, and of course, Wizards' behavior has encouraged this kind of approach as well.
Yeah.
But I find it really, there's so much about this design diary that I find fascinating, and I love Celeste as a designer. This is a very interesting, more than a I think design statement. This is a corporate statement, and the idea of saying, as someone who should be one of the closest partners to D&D, right? I mean, someone who's worked with D&D year in year out in so many products, so many ways. To say, we don't like where one D&D is going, so we're going to make our own version, and that as a company they're saying, we don't like that we only have the champion fighter to toy with as designers, so we're going to basically take the concepts of the other ones and change them a tiny bit and publish that. To which I think, well, that is great as a company, but that's not your role to consumers, right? Like, the consumer currently is using D&D 5e, which this blog acknowledges as the finest edition of D&D ever. The consumer has all of the available subclasses, and then they turn to Kobold Press for additional content, right? Remains to be seen, does the consumer actually want you to republish 5th edition with your take and with your version of all the other subclasses to the point that you wouldn't use the normal game? Because that's where they're headed, right? And I think that's a very untested theory. The last time this worked, it was built on a lot of anger, right? It was the company doing so was deliberately manipulating the anger of this edition change to try to create this effect. And they seem to be not quite going there, but maybe, they're trying to do that, right? Which is harder given the whole OGL resolution. But that's fascinating.
We know what this project looks like without that anger, and that's the EN World Level Up 5e, which maybe some folks have not even heard of. It was their own revision of their own Level Up of 5th edition. And it came out as 3 gorgeous hardcover books, with Mike Shea calling the Monster Collection his favorite book of last year. And you're still not going to see anybody playing it other than maybe a few really devoted folks. So that's the challenge of overcoming.
They're declaring their intention to make RC Cola in a country completely dominated by Coke.
Right.
I mean, it's one of the things that I found fascinating in the some of the reports about the shareholder call that Hasbro had, was that they were actually talking about, the resistance to the OGL and that whole situation, and they lost 50,000 subscribers on D&D Beyond, but they have 12 million. The outrage that has taken our little community here online by storm is not even 1% of their user base. We don't have a concept really of how big they are, how big and powerful the brand is. And they don't have a concept for how much collaboration and shared ideas and stuff like that are important at our level, and how much, this little churning engine of committed players and dabbling into designers and becoming designers and stuff turn into people like you, Teos, who become important designers in the field and may someday end up being actual employees at Wizard. I mean, most of those folks sitting at Wizards came from the OGL community of designers, and Wizards is able to hire really talented, really smart people whose ideas are going in the right direction and not have to train them. This is a really important part of their business that the people making business decisions don't understand. But we don't get just how little we matter when we start talking about brand and the power of that. The role-playing game is not very important. The biggest problem with D&D when you start comparing it to properties like Star Wars and Marvel is that there is no central storyline in D&D. When you say you're going to make a D&D movie, we can start having conversations about what world it's in long before we actually have settled on a storyline. The idea that this one's got a bard as the main character, all right, why not?
That's a good one. Yeah. Well, and that's going to be really fascinating if the movie takes off, right? That'll be a really interesting thing to see, and I suspect it will. I mean, the credits look as good as one could hope for this kind of a movie, right? You may not want the Guardians of the Galaxy approach. You may want gritty or something else, but given that it is the Guardians of the Galaxy approach, I mean, these trailers look great. I mean, the Valentine's Day teaser of the tea being hot and Hugh Grant saying that, like, I could play that over and over again. Did it have to be so hot? Like just over and over. It's just great. And Jean Rene Page just walking around being handsome. I mean, it's absurd, and it dwarfs how many D&D Beyond cancellations. Not that those things weren't important; they obviously were, right? We did achieve a level to which people had to stand up and take notice. But even before that, they were also standing up and taking notice.
I was amazed at how fast they backed down, how fast they put it into Creative Commons. It kind of backs up what you're saying, John, a little bit. It's like the role-playing game is not that important. It's like we don't really need to control it. We need the goodwill, and we need the brand to be loved. Type of thing.
D&D has done best when there were corporate reasons to ignore the game, right?
Yeah.
5th edition came out when it was not being scrutinized for what it was, for reasons that I can't talk about, and I don't think anybody has talked about. But 5th edition had a freedom to be written the way that team wanted to. 4th edition did not. Right? It had serious pressures, unrealistic, terribly created pressures, but it had them, and it hurt everything, right? And 3.5 did as well, right? That decision to go from 3rd to 3.5 was such a corporate, bring the curves back decision that was harmful to what it tried to do, and so the best thing D&D can do is not have the focus, and unfortunately, it has the focus. It has the eye of Sauron upon it, as one of my friends said, and that is not what you want when you're in the team. And I think that 1D&D feels like it has the eye of Sauron upon it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's wrap this up with a quick look through the first playtest packet. I'll kind of summarize it for us, and then I'll ask each of you to kind of, what's your highlight from it. So playtest packet 1 is out, backward compatible with 5th edition. Use all your existing 5e material, which Kobold Press has a lot of, so that's definitely important to them. Slightly more powerful. They say they don't like 1D&D, but they're doing the main change 1D&D did, giving a character an extra feat at first level. Or what's called talent there. And then a lot of this playtest is restating existing rules. There's not a lot of content here at the start. One thing I like that they did was roll in the ability score bumps all into ability scores. They've lived in a couple places before. They lived in races. Then they're going to move to backgrounds. They're in backgrounds of Pathfinder. I think they're they're partially in ancestries / races in Pathfinder. So they moved that up to there. They don't quite have the math right. The point value doesn't add up. The array doesn't add up to what the changes they made, but they can fix that. And then the playtest is pretty short. It's got 3 lineages, 6 heritages, like 2 backgrounds, and a few feats, maybe 12 feats or so. Lineage and heritage is the old race and the old sub-race. And the neat thing with heritages is that this is more your culture, and it can be with any lineage, which is more your biology. So you can mix and match that. But they're going to have to do a lot of hard work to make sure they balance that, because there's a lot of variation in power level, I'd say, between all these different lineages. And they've made little tweaks here and there to make them slightly different, but they're largely the same as what they are in 5th edition. Let's see here. And then after the heritage, we get to a couple backgrounds, which is the same, plus 1 feat. And then feats don't exist in the Creative Commons, so you're looking at having to redo every feat, and that's what they're doing here. Big variation in power level. They need to do some tweaking on these guys, and that's the extent of the playtest. So let me start with you, David. What do you think of the playtest so far?
Well, let me weigh in and then sign off, because you might have detected some subtle clues that I've got to go out and go to a wedding. My favorite,
by the way,
thing, my favorite thing that you mentioned that I noticed too is that what they're saying, we cut the unnecessary additional task of raising or lowering ability scores during 2 or other entirely different steps of character creation. So they streamlined that whole process of coming to the ability scores in a really good and intuitive way. I was really happy to see that. Let me just mention one other peeve that I've been living with as a burr under my saddle for a long time. I'm happy to see them use the term talents instead of feats. Way back during the design of 3rd edition, the team working on it was looking at non-weapon proficiencies in 2nd edition, and they noticed that some were skills and others enabled characters to perform particular stunts. So they called the skills, and they started calling the stunts feats. Well, now feats encompass a whole lot of extra stuff, but the word feat always sounded like sort of a misnomer to me. So I'm happy that we're seeing talents in this. It's a small thing, but I guess I'm pedantic. Anyway.
All right, David. Have fun at the wedding.
All right. Thanks, folks. Thanks, Teos.
Pleasure.
All right, John, what are your thoughts?
So, I mean, I think it's pretty light as far as content goes. I think one of the things that I noticed some of the little need for editing and work on the talents and stuff like that. But I was struck by a thing that you didn't mention, which each of the backgrounds contains an adventuring motivation, which gives you one role to determine what it is that your character is out there trying to adventure for, or you can pick one, obviously. But based just on this, these 12 pages, it looks like that's the replacement for the bonds, traits, flaws, and whatever else that we had in 5th edition. And that's a direction. While I don't think that the bonds, traits, and stuff like that is presented in 5th edition was interesting enough as a way to try and coach new players in the direction of role-playing beyond game mechanics and combat, this feels like it's moving away from trying to do that at all. And so I'm interested to see if this is really a direction they're going, if this is really just going to become a lot more mechanical and more wargamey, or if they will be looking for other ways to be trying to bring in some of the more social role-playing parts of the game.
And Teos, what are your thoughts so far?
Yeah, that's a fascinating angle to it, John, because it ties into my concern, which is the concept of the fantasy heartbreaker, right? Which is this term that is used and it's not meant to be disparaging, but that there are a lot of games out there that are basically D&D where you've changed one thing, and when you end up doing so, that game tends to not succeed because, well, for that one thing, I might as well just still play D&D. Right? Like, what is it that compels me to leave? And it's a heartbreaker because this person puts so much work into it, and yet people don't play it, right?
Right.
And I wonder whether Black Flag is a little too close to a fantasy heartbreaker. in that this is all good. And just like Level Up 5e, it's good. It's got some really good design, some neat innovations here and there that are, but the innovations are like you filed a rough burr off, right? They are not like 13th Age's one unique thing where you turn something on its head and change it, right? And you have an escalation die, and you have all these different things, or Shadow of the Demon Lord changing up the action economy and changing up the level progression and what that means. When you substantially change things, now you really have an RPG, right? And you have a reason to play that other RPG. It's still difficult to compete with D&D, but you've got something that is really yours. And when I look at this, it's all fine, but I don't know what truly compels a person to do this instead of doing 5e as their rule set. And I worry for that, because it's one thing to say, I'm Kobold Press, I make a book like Deep Magic 2. Anybody can use this in their D&D game, right? My audience is everybody who could possibly use this. Once you go down this path, now we're saying, I'm going to start talking about talents in my products, not feats. So now I'm catering to that audience that understands what I'm saying, or I've got to constantly translate it, right? Like, you're suddenly really segregating your audience down into this zone. Is that compelling enough for that to pull it off? I don't see that right now.
Yeah.
And I hope for Kobold Press that we do, and that there's nothing wrong with this design. We can quibble, whatever, but that's true of all design. I just don't see it elevating to that point where I go, oh, wow, you've reimagined 5e. I didn't realize I needed this, but boy, do I need this, right? This is the game I now want to play.
Right.
No, this is just fine to me.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, Teos. Do you have anything you want to
Thanks for having
share
me.
with how we can find your work, or what you're working on next, or anything like that?
Find me at alphastream.org. From there, you can get to all of my YouTube work. You can get to any of the products that I create. And very soon I'll have an article up on Forge of Foes. But you can go to Kickstarter and search for Forge of Foes and follow the page. That helps us greatly with the algorithmicals that are oh so important in this day and era. But if you follow there, even if you don't intend on backing, just having another person following that page is helpful to us. So thank you for doing that. And I hope you will look at it, because Forge of Foes is really fantastic, fantastic work.
All right. Thank you, Teos. I'm definitely going to get it. And
Yeah, I want it.
we'll talk to you later.
I need it now. Could you have like an early?
We have a free preview that's coming. It's through our Patreons, but the free preview will be there as soon as the project launches on March 1st.
I mean, I got a game a week from tomorrow that I need to prep for.
I'll send you all the preview documents. So it's got a number of monster powers and some good things.
Very cool.
All right. Thank you, guys. Bye, everyone.